Today, we have a guest on the show, and the history series I'm doing for you on Wales will continue in the next episode. Hey Pop, Shemai, how you doing? This is ben.llywelyn here, and today I've got a guest for you, Carl from Carl's Linguistic Kingdom, and we're going to talk about language learning today. So let's introduce the guest here. Carl, would you like to tell people a bit about your channel and what you provide for people? Which I'll put a link down below for everybody so they can check that out for you.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr. Thank you for having me on. I've been following your channel for a long time, so it's really cool to be a guest on your channel. So at my channel, I talk about learning the languages of the Isles. So that for me means the British Isles and Japan. So it sounds kind of a weird kind of combination, but they're all islands. So I'm learning Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, and Japanese, all for various reasons. But I do videos basically about that, and some of them are more historical based, a little bit like yours, and then some are just very linguistic based, like me saying, here's what I've been struggling with in Japanese, or here's how to say this word in Gaelic, that kind of thing.
Cool. I'd just like to say one thing I like about your channel is that your videos are they're quite bite-sized. It's a very different format to mine, which it's a nice contrast, which I find really interesting. And Carl puts quite bullet point kind of subject matter, which I find was really helpful, actually. So, Carl, why did you pick? And it is quite interesting that you have 3 island languages, as it were. So, why did you pick these 3 island languages, even though one is way over there and the 2 are in Britain here?
So, even though my channel focuses so much on the Celtic languages, especially Gaelic, I was actually got more serious about learning Japanese before that. I'd always been interested in the Celtic languages and language learning in general, but I grew up being a monolingual speaker and always wished that I'd grown up speaking more than one language. And so when my wife and I said, are we going to raise our kids to speak another language? We need to pick one. And the only one that we could both agree on, that we both liked and had learned a little bit of, was Japanese. So I thought, okay, we're both going to learn Japanese. My wife had already been to Japan. And it turned out this was actually a really good choice, because then after that, the company that I worked for in my day job was actually bought by a Japanese company. So now I work for a Japanese company. So it's like a really cool, oh, cool. Thank you, Lord. Kind of like, oh, that worked out really well. But it originally started like that. And then I thought, you know what? Duolingo, because I started on Duolingo.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it's got these heritage languages that I've always been fascinated by, but never thought I could learn, or never thought would even be possible to learn. I was like, just for fun, why don't I just see what Gaelic and Cymraeg is like? And then I'm like, oh, I love these too. And then I realized, wait a minute, they're all islands. I could connect with people about this. So it's almost like a happy little coincidence that all of that happened.
Okay, that's really cool. And so, what are your skill levels in these different languages? How far would you say you were compared each one with each other?
It's a good question, and I even talked about this on a recent video where near the beginning of the year, where I talked about like my language learning progress, like update, and because I'm so busy, I have to take turns in prioritizing different languages. So I'm not able to study them as much as I want. But I would say my strongest is probably Gaelic. I'm definitely an A2 level in that. I think I'm starting to push into the lower intermediate level for that. I'm kind of getting more comfortable with it. And I even speak Gaelic every morning to my son. I mean, he's too young to respond yet, but it at least forces me to use it every morning, and it, makes me feel more comfortable in it. So I would say A2 for Gaelic, also A2 for Japanese, but Japanese is so much harder for me that I can put in the same amount of time studying Japanese compared to Gaelic, and I'll make a lot more progress in Gaelic than I will in Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, it's very slow going. And then my Welsh, unfortunately, is the lowest of the three. I would say I'm A1, if that. But definitely loving, just the process of learning all of these.
Maybe I can help you with the learning Welsh bit. That's fascinating. You say that the Scots Gaelic, you put the same amount of energy in, and in Japanese, it's not taking off quite as much just because how different the languages are. And what's fascinating from my own, I've dabbled in Scots Gaelic, and these are Indo-European languages. Do you find Scots Gaelic do you find that there's a lot of it that you just know from having English?
I would say so. I think there's definitely a lot of loan words. And so those are usually kind of the easiest to remember. It's just like, oh, it's this word I already know. I'm just saying it a little differently. Like giraffe is shiraf. Or I was feeding my son this morning, and I was feeding him cantaloupe, and I'm like, how do you say cantaloupe in Gaelic? I'm like, I bet it'll be a lot like English, and I looked it up, and yeah, cantaloupe. It's like very similar. There's also some words that are completely different, and it's kind of like I never would have put that together. But I would say there's also a lot that almost sounds like a Latin root. And so, I know it's probably not influenced by Latin, but because the Celtic and Italic languages have a shared origin, and it's kind of like, oh, okay. So the amount that I had learned in college with Spanish and things like that, I'm like, oh, okay. So this is actually my Spanish background, and knowing English kind of helps with the Gaelic too. Like to write in Gaelic, skrivig, which is very similar to Spanish, and in that way, not only the English has helped, but also the Spanish has helped with Gaelic. And thankfully, there's also some cool overlap with Gaelic and Welsh, which maybe we can do a video about that sometime.
We could, absolutely. So if Japanese is so much more difficult, what keeps you motivated to learn each language? And are there different reasons that keep you motivated still for each language to keep learning?
So for each language, I think there are different types of motivation in that way. I would say for Japanese, one of the big ones is just anime. It's like that's a way where I can pretend that I'm studying, even though I'm not really getting a lot of immersion. It's like, oh, I'm gonna watch some Japanese. I'm studying right now. It's like, oh, okay. But the fact that one of the parent companies for my company is a large Japanese organization, that makes it to where there's definitely more of an incentive to learn, not just for me, but also it's become kind of a thing where I'm one of the people that other coworkers will come to if they have a question about Japanese, or if they want to learn a little bit, they're like, oh, go talk to Carl because he knows a little bit. And so in that way, I've become a little bit of a resource at my own company, and I can then count the studying that I do in Japanese almost like work. So in that way, that kind of keeps me motivated on that side of things. And in fact, I just found out that next month I'll actually be headed to Japan for work. It's my first time headed to Japan, and so I'm actually going to have to put all those skills to the test. We'll see how I actually do. But
That's wonderful.
so those kind of real world applications definitely give me more motivation for Japanese. But it is, like I said earlier, because it's so much harder. That also kind of, I have to have more motivation for that one because it is harder.
Mm.
It's easier for the Celtic languages because it's more like, oh, this is heritage, this is history, this is, this is in the blood, this is fun, it's relaxing. Whereas the Japanese is like, okay, this is some real work.
And I imagine part of learning a language is the cultural references, and at least it certainly has been with Welsh and French. And with Japanese, though, I mean, are there cultural references that you already know, or are you just landing on the moon?
That's a good good metaphor there. I would say it's a little bit of both. There's other aspects of Japanese culture that I was already interested in, even growing up. So Japanese cinema and Japanese martial arts. I've studied those for years, and in that way, that kind of gave me a little bit of a foundation into some of the culture. But as far as the cultural references within the language itself, sometimes that is a little bit of a challenge. I'm having a hard time thinking of a particular linguistic example, but I think the biggest hurdle for me in Japanese, which is also related to culture, is how heavily contextual that Japanese is. It's almost like the language itself is shorthand in the way we would kind of think of things, especially like, watching a show or something and you see how they translate it in English and it's got, all these details. There's an article here and the pronoun and everything, whereas all of that has been left out of the original sentence in Japanese because it was all assumed in the context. And so having to kind of change my mindset to that.
Is it because of the grammar of Japanese allows them to do that?
Yes, and it's the grammar, and it's also that is just part of the culture. You're expected to understand the context to the point where they can leave out words. And that's something that's been kind of tricky to get used to.
So if we're saying like the pan is in the kitchen, they would just say pan kitchen or something.
A little bit like that. Or what's another one? So inpitsu ga arimasu ka would be like the literal translation is there a pencil?
Mm-hmm.
But depending on the situation I'm in, you could translate that as, do you have a pencil? Is that a pencil? You could qualify it with the word that, but depending on the situation you're in, the meaning will kind of change. Mm-hmm. So I could be asking for a pencil, or I could be asking if the person I'm talking to has one, if they have one in their possession. Mm-hmm. But it's just the same in the way it's spoken. So it's very heavily dependent on context.
Okay. And have you been, you're going to Japan, have you been to Scotland or Wales?
Not yet. I want to, though. It's on the list.
Well, maybe we could sort something out here in Wales at some point. It's a wonderful place. So in terms of the languages here, two of these are Celtic languages, so I understand learning those together. And then Japanese, it's an agglutinative language. So just for the viewers here, agglutinative means it glues things onto the end, like Finnish or Turkish. So you get all these really long words. I mean, people say that Welsh words are long. Do you think that helps learn either or the other, or do you think Celtic and Japanese are so far apart that they don't help each other to learn either at all?
難しい質問ですね. I said that's a difficult question, isn't it? In they are so different that I don't think there's a lot of overlap. What happens more often than not for me is just that if I know a word in one language but I don't know it in the other, my mind is reaching for that. Like I was doing that this morning. I was trying to say a sentence in Gaelic, and I knew all of the words except one word, and so my mind went to the word in Japanese, which doesn't help me. But that, I think, is more just a symptom of, learning multiple languages at once rather than them being similar or different. Occasionally, I've gotten mixed up with Gaelic and Welsh because they'll be similar enough to sometimes blend in my mind. But the Japanese and the Celtic languages are so dissimilar. They're in that way, I don't think they really help or hinder.
Do you find that there's a specific way that you prefer learning Welsh? I mean, my channel deals with Welsh, so I'm a bit interested in, is there something that you found that helps you learn Welsh better than anything else? Or is it just is it a Duolingo approach, or is it a hobby, which is perfectly valid? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons to learn.
When I first started, I actually did a video on this on my channel, where I talked about how I was learning. And Duolingo was, of course, how I got started. And I was also using the Say Something in Welsh app. Duolingo has been the main way I've been learning. That and YouTube videos, honestly. Videos like on your channel and on some other channels where they, like the Learn Welsh podcast with Jason Shepard, things like that. I find that learning better from hearing people speak things and seeing it written down at the same time, especially in video form. That's been helpful.
Yeah.
There is a Welsh course that I want to take, but I've not taken it yet because I've just been so busy with everything else and focused on these other things. Because I'm taking a Japanese course, I'm taking a Gaelic course. There's only so many language courses you can do at once.
Yeah.
And I think that whenever I do take that, or maybe even do one of the maybe the Welsh government type, programs, or those like immersion type things you can do long distance. If I do something like that, I think it's going to be more helpful for me. Whereas doing those kind of video-based lessons and courses is really helpful to me for the Celtic languages. In Japanese, I think actually the thing that helps the most, to help it sink in the most, is actually reading. I wouldn't say I'm very good at reading yet.
Yeah.
But because it's completely different script, and there's several types of writing, because it's just so different having to read it, especially in the course that I'm taking, where it's these series of short stories read by a native speaker and I'm reading along while they're saying it out loud. That has been kind of more helpful than I think it would be for the Celtic languages. Because Celtic languages, there's much less of a reading barrier since we're using the Roman alphabet.
Yeah. And Speaking of that reading barrier with Japanese, I mean, there's three scripts. Am I getting that right? They have a Chinese influenced one.
Mhm.
They have a native Japanese one, and then they have one that's based off Latin. Is that right?
Yes. So there's the kanji. Those are the Chinese character influenced ones. And because of that, somebody who reads Japanese characters will be able to read at least a certain percentage of Mandarin, which is actually kind of cool. They're actually just with those characters, there's some mutual intelligibility that's still there even after hundreds of years. Though they would be read completely differently, but at least the way they're written has some similar meanings, which is kind of cool. So that's kanji. Then you have hiragana, which is the, you know, I hesitate to use the word alphabet because it's more sound groupings than vowel consonant specific.
It's like phonemes.
Yeah, it's more phonemes. And then they've got a very similar to hiragana. They've also got katakana, which is almost the same thing as hiragana, except it's for loan words. So some of them actually look almost identical, or they're very similar to the hiragana, but it's only used for loan words, whether it's from English, a lot of it's English, or some of it's Portuguese. So when you're reading a sentence in Japanese, you've got these three different writing systems that are all taking turns.
And they mix these up in the same sentence, do they?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to say that Welsh is difficult.
Yeah. That's what I tell people too. They're like, "Oh, so you're doing that? You're doing the Scottish Gaelic, and you're doing Welsh and Japanese." You're like, "Oh, Welsh, it's so hard." I'm like, "It's the easiest of the three." They look at me weird, like, "What? What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Have you met Japanese?"
And do you find people where you are in America to speak any of these languages with?
So that's the good thing about working for a Japanese company is occasionally there'll be a coworker who works for the parent company who's actually from Japan, and I can practice with. As far as Welsh and Gaelic, it's usually people I've met online.
Yeah.
Like there's actually a man who lives in the city near me who has been learning Gaelic as well, and we live close enough that we were able to go meet at a restaurant. And the only reason he had found me was because of my channel, and then he wrote a comment saying he lives in this city. I'm like, oh, I live there too. So occasionally there's that, and then I've even connected with people in Scotland
Cool.
through that. And I'm also in some Welsh Facebook groups where we're talking about learning Welsh, and so I'll usually learn some stuff there. But or this is a little funny. I've got a friend of mine who decided to learn as many languages as he could on Duolingo. He wanted to get 1,000,000 points. He didn't make it to 1,000,000 points, but he did. He said, "Carl, I want to beat you in all of the languages you're learning for all the points you have." And so he was always trying to one up me in Welsh. And so whenever I see him, I try to practice the Welsh with him.
I find that's a really good way to learn languages and just a bit of banter going back and forth. And speaking of banter, I mean, that's a really big part of all the cultures of these islands here where I am. And I wonder, does Japan have, how do you find their sense of humor as a culture? And does that affect the language learning?
Wow, that is a really good question. I don't know if I've ever thought of that. On the one hand, Japan has this reputation for being very stiff and formal. And in a lot of ways that is kind of true because there's, these etiquette forms that are, part of things. But as far as getting to know someone one on one, I think once they know that you're learning their language, they just kind of open up, and they're very willing to talk about stuff, and um, kind of learn from you, and you learn from them. I
Yeah.
would say maybe there's a gap in under maybe not understanding the jokes, but knowing what is a joke and what's not.
Hmm.
Sometimes there's kind of like uh, you'll make a joke and they're not sure if it was a joke or not, because there's much less emphasis in Japanese culture on sarcasm. Kind of dry humor or sarcasm is, as I understand it, less common in Japan. So sometimes that can be a thing. But getting to know people is pretty easy, at least here, because they're in a world where most people are. If they're in the U.S., then they're in a world where most people are not speaking Japanese, and so when they find somebody who is, it's like an instant connection.
Okay. And where do you see your channel and these languages going? Because I mean, one thing that I've found is that your language journey is never truly over. It's something that you sculpt and create, and you create a life in a language in a way. You said you're raising a child and talking Scots Gaelic to the child, and I find that very interesting. I think that's commendable, by the way, to introduce a minority language to a child. That's important, I think. But where do you see these going, these languages for you?
I think in some ways it's, uh, I mean, it's definitely a hobby, clearly, but more than that, it's a way to connect with my roots, and it's a way to connect with other people who
Mm.
have these type of interests, like you.
Yeah.
And it it's also just fun. As far as where the channel would go, I hope that I can become kind of an encouragement to people to keep learning these, endangered heritage languages. Um, that's something that you and I share. It's like, oh, these languages are still important and they're still here. We need to keep speaking them. And I mean, Japanese is not going anywhere, so Japanese doesn't need my help. But Gaelic and Welsh, could use some friends. And as I learn more about these languages and I learn how to speak them better, I of course want to be able to travel to Scotland, travel to Wales, experience the culture, meet the people, practice the language with people that are fluent, and be able to have that be something that's shared with my children as well. Because that's something where not only is it me, you need to teach my son who's Gaelic, and I'm reading him this book that's in Welsh, and he gets that influence and that culture enrichment. But it's also like that's an experience that I would have loved to have had, where I go to
Yeah.
another country with a parent, and then we're both speaking that language in that country. That has got to make for some amazing memories. But um, it's a gift that I'm trying to give to my kids.
That's really cool, and I do commend that. It's really honorable of you to do, I think. On my own journey, especially with Welsh, people often ask why I learned it. Well, it's the potential of the future, I think, is what
Mm-hmm.
makes it special. But regarding you and your channel, I think from what I've seen, your Scots Gaelic side has been a bit more successful. Do people reach out to you in terms of different ones of these languages? Which one seems to attract more interest, do you think, from
Definitely
people like
Gaelic.
you? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely Gaelic is the one. I've even gotten people ask in the comments like, "Oh, I'm getting a Gaelic tattoo. Can you translate this for me?" Or, um, "Will you explain this?" Or, "What does this mean?" Or, "How would you say this?" And some of these, it's like I am not qualified to answer some of these questions. Um, you know,
The
but
best way to
I,
learn is to teach.
yeah, yeah. Teach to learn, learn to teach. I think I think in that way, having the channel and sharing my journey with other people is almost like it helps hold me accountable to continuing the learning.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've experienced that too, but
Oh, absolutely. In a way. Go on. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, you were already fluent in these languages before you started, but for me, it's almost like that's something that I saw was a little bit of a gap on the language bubble in YouTube. Is there's so many people who they learn a bunch of languages or they get really good at some languages and then they impress people with how good they are at them. And I think there's value in that.
As long as you're not rubbing it down people's noses.
Yeah, yeah. But I thought, it's really refreshing to see people that are still learning and then sharing that, even with all its failures and stuff, because
That's exactly one of the things
it
that
takes
appealed to me about your channel is that there's the potential there, and it's it's a journey, and I mean I understand why you chose it to be Kingdom, but it's almost like Carl's lingo journey in a way, and to my viewers, I hope you go on his journey and learn about his languages as he does. And Carl, thank you so much for joining us.
Jochen Bauer.
I'll put a link to all his stuff below, and I hope you check it out. And thank you for being on the show.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
If you would like to see the video where Carl interviews me on his channel, watch this video here.